Okay, I hope I'm audible to all students who are attending this lecture of Introductory Microeconomics. We continue with our lectures on consumer theory, which is formally chapter 21 of the book I prefer to follow for the Introductory Microeconomics course. This is Gregory and Mankiw, and I prefer to follow the 4th edition for my lectures on this course. Okay, so let's quickly recall. In the previous lecture of consumer theory, we were doing a very important concept. We were bifurcating the price effect. We were bifurcating the price effect into two effects called the substitution effect, and the income effect. Okay, and all students can quickly recall. Substitution effect captures the change in demand, or I can say the change in optimal choice, when the relative prices change, when the relative prices which are captured by Px by Py. Px is the price of commodity X, Py is the price of commodity Y. So substitution effect is going to capture the change in demand when relative prices change, keeping the purchasing power constant, keeping the real purchasing power constant. And then we have the income effect. Income effect is gonna capture the change in demand. It is going to capture the change in demand when the purchasing power changes, when the purchasing power changes, keeping the relative prices constant, keeping the relative prices which are captured by Px by Py constant. Okay, so and price effect is nothing but the sum of substitution effect and income effect. And the price effect is used to derive the demand. Price effect is used to derive the demand. Okay, so all students can recall in the previous lecture we were also doing some diagrams. Okay, we had done the diagram for a case when good X and good Y were normal goods and price of good X falls. So all students can recall in my previous lecture, we had done the diagrammatic analysis. We had done the diagrammatic analysis of the case when both good X and good Y, when both good X and good Y are normal goods, when both good X and good Y are normal goods and price of good X falls, keeping price of good Y and income M of the consumer constant. So we had done the diagram for this particular case. I had drawn the diagram where we had shown the substitution effect and the income effect. Now in this particular lecture, we continue with the same set of diagrams. So table explaining the substitution effect and income effect. Table explaining the substitution effect and the income effect. So we continue with the same analysis in this particular lecture as well. So I can write continue. It's getting continued from the previous lecture. Okay, so let's draw a table and let's take fresh cases today. So on your screens, you can see the table. This is my first column. Okay, this is again cases for price of good X falling when price of good Y and income are constant. Okay, here we have the price effect, which is the sum of substitution effect plus the income effect. And then guys, we have the corresponding diagram to illustrate this case. Okay, so let's look at the second case in this lecture. The first case was done in the previous lecture. This is the second case when good X is inferior good, when good X is inferior good and good Y is a normal good. Good Y is a normal. So let's look at this case. Good X is an inferior commodity, good Y is a normal commodity, and I want to bifurcate the price effect into substitution effect and income effect when price of good X is falling, keeping price of good Y and income constant. Now let's look at this table first. Price effect is the sum of substitution effect and income effect, right? Now, when price of good X falls, what is the first thought which will come to your mind? Good X price has fallen. It has become more cheaper relative to good Y. Let me buy more of it and less of good Y. This is my substitution effect because substitution effect has nothing to do with the purchasing power. It has only to do with the relative price. When price of good X falls, okay, the relative prices have changed. Good X has become now more cheaper than good Y in relative terms. So you will buy more of good X and less of good Y. But now guys, what will be the income effect? Now look at this. When price of good X falls, the purchasing power, when price of good X falls, the purchasing power, what is my purchasing power captured by in this case? The purchasing power, which is M by PX, goes up. Purchasing power goes up. Now, your purchasing power has gone up, but good X is an inferior good. Now, inferior goods have negative relationship with income. So, when your purchasing power or when your real income, I can say purchasing power is nothing but my real income. So, when my purchasing power has gone up, I will buy less of the inferior good. But since my purchasing power has gone up, I will buy more of the normal good because good Y is my normal. Okay, and then if you all can recall from my previous lecture where I had drawn a table to explain substitution effect and income effect, all of you can recall that demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping. All students can recall that the demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping. Now we know the result. If the demand curve is downward sloping for inferior goods, when price of good X falls, what should be my price effect? When Px falls, in nutshell, my Qx should rise. And when will Qx rise? Qx will rise when my substitution effect dominates the income effect. You need to understand it, guys. We know the end result. The end result is that when Px falls, in net terms, my Qx should rise. Now, Qx is rising by substitution effect, but falling by income effect. But in totality, we want Qx to rise. That will happen only when substitution effect dominates the income effect. So I can say, therefore, in case of inferior goods, the substitution effect always dominates the income effect. So I can quickly draw a diagram. Let's quickly draw a diagram. So on the horizontal axis, we have good X, which is an inferior good. And on y-axis, we have good Y, which is a normal good. Always draw the budget lines first. If you can recall, in the previous lecture also I had mentioned that always draw the budget lines first. So this is our initial budget line, AB. When price of good X falls, what happens? When price of good X falls, good X becomes more cheaper. You can now afford to buy more of it. So my budget line shifts from AB to AB1. My budget line shifts from AB to AB1. Now guys, how do I capture substitution effect? Now to capture the substitution effect, the purchasing power has to be kept constant. So understand this, I am erasing this part and I am writing it. Now to capture the substitution effect, purchasing power must be kept constant. Purchasing power must be kept constant. Now, how do we keep the purchasing power constant? Now, guys, our purchasing power is M by Px. When my denominator has fallen, to make M by Px constant, I will also have to do what? I will have to reduce my numerator as well. Then only this whole expression will become constant. It is very simple and logical. Mathematically, how do you make a fraction constant? If your denominator has fallen, you also reduce the numerator. And since, if you all can recall, we are doing the substitution effect by Hicks. We are doing the Hicks substitution effect. It was given by the economist J.R. Hicks. So what does Hicks say? To capture the substitution effect, we will take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve. This is the line I spoke in the previous lecture also. To capture the substitution effect, we will take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve. Now guys, we are on the budget line AB1. When I take away income from the consumer, the budget line will shift parallelly inwards. You can see the budget line will shift parallelly inwards. This is my compensated budget line CD. Why compensated? Because to capture the substitution effect, we have to keep the purchasing power constant. Now, when price of good X went down, purchasing power went up. To keep it constant, we have to take away income from the consumer. And we will take away income from the consumer in such a way so that he is on the same indifference curve. Now guys, now we can plot the indifference curves. Suppose on the budget line AB, the consumer was consuming somewhere here. Now on the budget line CD, where will the consumer consume? The consumer will consume on this segment. So I can draw a point here. Okay, so both these points should lie on the same indifference curve. Okay, so I can draw an indifference curve connecting both these points. Suppose this is my indifference curve I0. This was my initial equilibrium. This is my new equilibrium. Movement from E0 to E1 denotes what? It denotes the substitution effect. So movement from E0 to E1, I can write movement from E0 to E1 denotes the Higgs substitution effect. So hoping all students have understood this. So you can clearly see when you are moving from E0 to E1, Qx is rising, Qy is falling. And now how do we capture the income effect? Whatever income I had taken away from the consumer, I give the consumer back that income. That means now we are moving from the budget line CD back to the red budget line AB1. In income, how do we capture income effect? Basically, whatever income you had taken away from the consumer in the initial place, you give the consumer back that much income. So consumer is back to the red budget line AB1. Now, if you look at the chart, according to the income effect, QX should fall and QY should rise. That means starting from E1, because we have reached E1 now. Okay, we have reached E1 and starting from E1, now our QX should fall, QY should rise, but QX should fall in such a way so that substitution effect is still dominating the income effect. That means, guys, our point will somewhere come here. You can see from E1 to E2, my good X is falling, satisfying the income effect. But if you look at the nutshell, in nutshell, you can see that your substitution effect is dominating the income effect. So my indifference curve will come somewhere here. So you can see on your screens the brown indifference curve I2. So I can say movement from E1 to E2 is my income effect. Now, when you are moving from E1 to E2, you can see QX is falling. You can see QY is rising. But you can clearly see that since it's the case of an inferior good, you can see that your substitution effect is dominating the income effect. You can see that SE is more than YE. Look at this arrow and look at this tiny arrow. And I can write movement from E0 to E2 is my total price effect. So you can see ultimately, guys, ultimately we are moving from E0 to E2 only. But movement from E0 to E2 is split into two parts. Movement from E0 to E1, which is the substitution effect, and movement from E1 to E2, which is the income effect. And you can see that the budget line AB1 is parallel to the budget line CD. That means when you are moving from the budget line CD to AB1, your relative prices are not changing. Your purchasing power is changing. So you need to understand this. When we move from the budget line, when we move from budget line AB to the budget line CD, what is happening? When we move from budget line AB to CD, relative prices change. Relative prices change, but purchasing power is constant. But purchasing power is constant. When you are moving from the budget line AB to CD, relative prices are changing, but purchasing power is constant. So movement from AB to CD is capturing the substitution effect. And similarly, I can erase this part and I can write that when we are moving from the budget line CD to the budget line AB1, in this case, purchasing power is changing. Purchasing power changes, but relative prices are constant, but the relative prices are constant. That is why you can see that both these budget lines are parallel to each other, because when you're moving from the budget line CD to the budget line AB1, purchasing power is changing, but your relative prices are constant. So that means that movement from the budget line CD to AB1 captures the income effect. So hoping all students have understood this. And guys, now if I quickly draw the demand curve for you, so erasing all this, if I draw the demand curve, because how is the demand curve derived? It is derived from the price effect, which is the sum of substitution and income effect. So if I draw a small demand curve for you, so we are drawing the demand curve for good X. Why? Because price of good X is changing, price of good Y is not changing. So we need not draw the demand curve for good Y. We need to draw the demand curve for good X as price of good X is changing. So we can clearly see initially our price was Px, and I can label this as this is X0 guys, this is X1 and this is X2. Okay, so initially my demand was X0. When my price falls from Px to Px dash, when my price falls from Px to Px dash, ultimately we are moving from E0 to E2, so my X is rising. So from X0, okay, one more thing I want to make it clear, this is X1. This is X1 corresponding to E1 and this is X2 corresponding to E2. This is X2 corresponding to E2. So ultimately we are moving from X0 to X2. This is my total price effect. So if I join these points, I get the demand curve, which is again downward sloping. That means what do we learn? We learn that the demand curve for inferior commodities is also downward sloping. Why is it downward sloping? Because the substitution effect is dominating the income effect in the case of inferior goods. So I hope students have understood this particular case. And guys, then we can look at the second case, the third case. Remember the first case we had done in the previous lecture. Second case, you can see on your screens, when good X is inferior and price of good X falls, we get a downward sloping demand curve, and we learn that the substitution effect dominates the income effect for inferior goods. Now let's look at the third case. Okay, let's look at the third case and let's draw the corresponding diagram for the third case as well. So I am first erasing all the irrelevant portions before starting off with the next case. Okay, so now you can see everything else is remaining the same. Now the case we are having is when good X is a Giffen good. We now have the case when good X is a Giffen good and good Y is a normal good. Now quickly, first of all students can recall, till the time I am erasing, please recall what are Giffen goods. Giffen goods are extreme cases of inferior goods, or I can say they are the worst lot among the inferior commodities. So we have the case 3 in front of us, okay, which is as follows. When good X is a Giffen good, okay, when good X is a Giffen good and good Y is a normal good, good X is a Giffen good and good Y is a normal good, okay, and price of good X is falling. Okay, now quickly, if I look at the substitution effect and income effect, guys, the substitution effect will not change because substitution effect has nothing to do with income or purchasing power. It has just to do with the relative prices. Now, when price of good X is falling, very simple. In relative terms, good X is becoming cheaper to good Y. You buy more of good X, you buy less of good Y. And if you now look at the income effect, when price of good X falls, your purchasing power goes up. Your purchasing power goes up, but good X is a different good. You will buy less of it. You will buy more of the normal good. So I hope students are clear with the arrows and the indications. According to substitution effect, good X rises, good Y falls, but according to the income effect, good X will fall and good Y will rise. Why is that happening? Because when your price of good X falls, your purchasing power goes up. When your purchasing power goes up, you will now prefer to buy less of the Jiffin and more of the normal good. Why? Because Jiffin is the worst case of inferior goods. Or I can say these are the worst goods among the inferior goods. Now all students can recall that Jiffin goods violate the law of demand. Jiffin goods violate the law of demand. As we had done in the initial lectures of the introductory microeconomics course, in case of Jiffin goods, the demand curve will come out as upward sloping. Now that means if price of good X is falling, what will my answer be? My QX should also fall. And when will QX fall? QX will fall when my income effect dominates the substitution effect. Because according to substitution effect, QX is rising. According to income effect, QX is falling. When PX falls, QX must fall because demand curve for Jiffin goods is upward sloping. That means for Jiffin goods, price and demand will move in the same direction. So how will I make QX fall? QX will fall only when my income effect will dominate the substitution. So quickly, if I draw a diagram now for the Jiffin case, as you can see on your screens, this is good X, which is now a Jiffin good. Good X, which is now a Jiffin good. Okay, and then we have good Y, which is now a normal good. Always let's draw the budget lines first. So this is our initial budget line, which is AB. When price of good X falls, good X becomes more cheaper. You can now afford to buy more of it. So we have the red budget line AB1. Now how do I capture the substitution effect? To capture the substitution effect, the purchasing power must be kept constant. When price of good X falls, purchasing power goes up. How will I keep the purchasing power constant? So according to Hicks, if we are following the substitution effect explained by Hicks, we take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve as before. And when I take away income from the consumer, we move from the budget line AB1 to the budget line CD. So you can see this is my compensated budget line CD. I am taking away income from the consumer, so we are shifting inwards from AB1 to CD in such a way so that we are on the same indifference curve. Now, guys, we can draw the indifference curve. Suppose initially the consumer was consuming on the budget line AB at this point. Now he will consume on the budget line CD on this particular portion. So both these points should lie on the same indifference curve. So you can see this is my indifference curve I0, this is E0, and this is E1. Okay, and then you can see that movement from E0 to E1 denotes the substitution effect. Again, when we are moving from E0 to E1, what is changing? When we are moving from E0 to E1, the relative price is changing. The purchasing power is constant. So you can clearly see it's satisfying our chart. You can see when we are moving from E0 to E1, QX is rising and QY is falling when we move from E0 to E1. Now to capture the income effect, from starting from E1, QX should fall and QY should rise. First of all, guys, how will I capture the income effect? Whatever income I had taken away from the consumer, I will give the consumer back that much income. So we are back to the budget line AB1. Now on the budget line AB1, where will the consumer consume? Now QX should fall and QX should fall in such a way so that it even dominates the substitution effect. So if you can clearly see, where will your point come? Your point will come somewhere here. E1 to E2, you can see this is my X2 and you can see movement from X1 to X2 is my income effect and you can clearly see that income effect dominates the substitution effect. For this particular case of different commodities, income effect dominates the substitution effect. That means my indifference curve will come somewhere here. This is I2. So I hope students have understood this. Substitution effect is the movement from X0 to X1. Income effect is the movement from X1 to X2. You can clearly see that now the income effect is dominating the substitution effect. That means if I talk about in net terms we are moving from E0 to E2 and good X is falling in net terms when price of good X falls. So if I draw the demand curve, how will the demand curve look like? This is good X. This is the price of good X. Okay. This was the initial price and this was the initial combination X0. When price of good X falls from Px to Px dash, you can clearly see that your demand for good X is also falling from X0 to X2. And when I join both these points, I get the demand curve, which is upward sloping for Giffen goods. So you can clearly see that Giffen goods are violating the law of demand. Why are they violating the law of demand? Because in this case, the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect. The income effect is pulling down the demand for good X by a higher magnitude than the increase in demand by substitution effect. So in nutshell or in net terms, if good X is a Giffen good and its price falls, in net terms, its demand will also fall. So in that particular case, if you plot both these points, you will see that your demand curve for different goods is coming out as upward sloping. Now guys, this was corresponding to point E0 and this is corresponding to point E2. Remember, when you are plotting the demand curve, you are not concerned with point E1 because point E1 lies on the compensated demand curve. Your CD budget line is your compensated budget line. When we capture price effect is captured by comparing E0 with the final equilibrium E2. So if I compare E0 with E2 in net terms, we are falling. So when price of good X falls, demand is also falling. So if I plot my demand curve for different commodities is upward sloping. So I hope all students have understood this case as well. Okay. Now this is where I intend to stop. Homework for all students for this particular lecture. Draw the table explaining substitution effect and income effect with the help of a diagram for the following case. for the following case. So guys, I'm writing the case for all of you. The case is as follows. Price of good X rises and price of good Y and income are constant, and within this case 1, good X and good Y both are normal. Good X and good Y both are normal goods. Second case, good X is inferior. Good X is inferior and good Y is normal. And then we have the third case, which is good X is Jiffen and good Y is normal. So all students will draw the table exactly the way I have drawn in my lectures. Now I have changed the case. I have discussed in my lecture the case for price of good X falling. Homework for all of you, you will draw at your homes the case for price of good X rising. When price of good Y and income are constant, both are normal, good X is inferior, good Y is normal, good X is different, good Y is normal. And you will explain the substitution effect and income effect using your diagrams. You can mail me your answers. You can mail me your answers at this email ID, which I am writing on the screen, so that I can correct them. Okay, students anyways know my email ID by now. It has been the same throughout my lectures. You can mail me your answers at this email ID. Okay, or put your answers on the WhatsApp group. Put your answers on the WhatsApp group for this course. So for every course, I run a WhatsApp group. So you can put your answers for this particular case on the WhatsApp group, which is made for this course. So this is where I intend to stop. I hope all students have enjoyed this lecture. In the next lecture of consumer theory, we will be looking at some applications as to where do we apply the concept of substitution effect and income effect in real life. So again, the next lecture is going to be very important and interesting. But for now, I stop in this lecture. I hope all students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubts? You can unmute your mics and ask or call up, or you can mail me your doubts at this particular email ID. So this is where I stop in this particular lecture.